Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for today's program. Today we're going to be talking about something that is still relevant after 2 or 3 decades, and that is this book by Francis Schaeffer called A Christian Manifesto. Here in the United States at this time, we're going through an election year. On top of everything else, we've just come through, and we're almost through, a coronavirus epidemic, lockdown, recession, and at the same time as the election is coming up, we're also getting a Supreme Court justice to replace a very far left liberal activist judge, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're getting another appointee by the president, and so everything seems to be happening in our country, the United States, at the same time. But this book by Francis Schaeffer is one of the most insightful, clear, and simple explanations as to what is happening here in our Western world today. And that's what we basically are dealing with here in the United States at this time. We're doing an extension of what has already taken place in Europe, even more so in Europe, the secularization of Europe. And Francis Schaeffer, 30 years ago, explained this whole process and what we're experiencing now in our nation. And we're seeing the riots, we're seeing socialism as a viable idea, communism, Marxism as a viable alternative government structure and economic structure. These are concepts that for most of the history of the United States were seen as dangerous, subversive, and actually challenged the whole core of our system. And Francis Schaeffer explains these are simply an outgrowth and an outpouring of the materialistic worldview. So we're going to talk about Francis Schaeffer's book, A Christian Manifesto, why it's so important today. If you ever get a chance to read this, I would highly suggest go to a library or try to get online, Amazon.com. You can find these copies of these in the used bookstores occasionally, and I've seen them, 2 or 3 of them available just in the last couple weeks at used bookstores that I've been browsing. It really is a profound little book. Francis Schaeffer, some of you may not understand, Francis Schaeffer started out as a pastor here in the United States on the East Coast. He and his wife and family packed up after World War II and headed out to Europe to do evangelism in Europe, and wound up staying the remainder of his life until just a short time before his death in Switzerland, and founded a Christian ministry there in Switzerland, and was known as a sort of a intellectual for the hippie generation. Teenagers and youth and young people, 20-somethings, even 30-somethings, even older, would find their way to what was called L'Abri, his Christian ministry there in Switzerland, and he would answer their questions. Apologetics was his forte. As a theologian and as an evangelist, his forte was apologetics. He would explain the Bible, he would explain Christianity in relationship to the culture. The pop culture. He loved pop culture. He loved to explore the arts and science and philosophy and theology, and he loved to relate all of that to the Bible and what the Christian worldview understanding. And in this Christian Manifesto, which has shaped a lot of thinking here in the United States, even if you don't know it, it did shape a lot of people about 30 years ago and has continued to shape thinking of an entire generation of evangelical Christians. Not so much today. Very few people talk about him today in the younger generation. But in the previous generation, the baby boomers were highly influenced by Francis Schaeffer. And what he did was he explained what happens when a worldview shifts from the Judeo-Christian worldview here in the Western world to a secular materialistic view of reality. And he explains basically in the first chapter, that's called Abolition of Truth and Morality, he explains what happens when you substitute a secular, materialistic, evolutionary, atheistic worldview for the Judeo-Christian worldview that helped shape the founding of this nation, the United States, in 1776. Now, he explains that not all of the founding fathers were Bible-believing Christians, but all of them were born and were raised and worked and lived in a Christian milieu. They were born and raised in a Christian culture where the Bible was the most popular book that was read. Well, many students at that time actually learned how to read by reading the Bible. Christian principles and actually the theories of law and justice were obtained from the Bible. And if you listen to and look at some of the founding fathers, their speeches, their statements, their sayings, you can see Bible verses and Bible concepts all throughout. And if you just look also in the founding documents of our country, the United States, you'll see, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, the Judeo-Christian worldview comes through very clearly in that. For example, why was there a phrase, the Creator and Creator's laws, nature and nature's God? Why was there a phrase called, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights? Those rights were based not on a social contract. They were based not on a government tribunal or a committee. They were based in the Creator. Created men and women with inalienable rights. They were created in the image of God with rights from the get-go. It didn't come from government, it came from God. This is all part of the cultural worldview that was taking place at the time of the founding fathers. And even if they weren't Orthodox Bible-believing Christians, they actually did believe these principles. But if you fast forward now 200 and some years today, you'll see a vast difference in the way people think about the world and their worldview in general, especially in the colleges and universities, and also down into the public schools. What you see taking place, and this is what Francis Schaeffer notes here in the Christian Manifesto, and others were at the time in the early 80s, during the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, Christians were beginning to understand that, hey, we're experiencing a worldview revolution here in this country. And a lot of the assumptions that had prevailed in this country for almost 200 years, they were now being discarded. And what's happening, for example, in the public schools now is a totally secular view of reality is being taught to the children. This is being taught at the college level and university most forcefully today. The prevailing, predominant worldview in the universities and colleges, and I'm not talking about private Christian colleges, I'm talking about the state colleges and universities, is a materialism and almost a cultural Marxism. Different views on justice, different views on equity, different views on righteousness, what is right, what is wrong. Morality now, we saw, for example, the gender revolution that took place 3 years ago when the Supreme Court passed a decision basically declaring same-sex marriage equal with traditional Judeo-Christian marriage. This had long been coming in the universities and colleges and in the secular world, but it's now being codified in law at the present moment. And this is part of the struggle we're going through. For example, right now, there is a replacement for the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just recently passed away. And the president is nominating a more conservative, a more originalist, who will interpret the Constitution and not be an activist like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. But it's not just the judicial activism that's being fought for today. You would think that because a Supreme Court justice passes away and another one has to replace that justice, you would think it would be a rather boring process to pass along another justice to the Supreme Court. But it's not. Why isn't it a boring process? It should be a boring process because the justices, the way they were originally envisioned by the Founding Fathers, was the justices of the Supreme Court were simply supposed to call balls and strikes. They were supposed to be the umpires. They were supposed to look at laws. They were supposed to look at the Constitution. And they were simply to sit down and say, okay, what was the original intent of this law? What was the original intent of the Constitution, this article of the Constitution? And simply clarify and define what the law is and what the law isn't, and then ship it back to the legislation and say, this is what the law allows and this is what the law doesn't allow. So it's basically a simple matter of calling balls and strikes. That was the original intent of the Supreme Court. They were not ever envisioned and never supposed to be this powerful, overarching power of the United States government that actually, instead of just calling balls and strikes, creates law, creates legislation, shapes, crafts policy, and this activist, this entangled power that basically rules over the other branches of government. It was never intended to do that. And the reason we have such a great big fight on our hands when a conservative president wants to appoint a conservative judge is because the other side, the liberal, the leftist, the Democrat, the radical, wants to continue to see activist liberal judges on the bench like Ruth Bader Ginsburg because they were getting their worldview agenda activated and executed through the courts. The biggest example of this, and Francis Schaeffer talks about this, the Christian Manifesto, I highly recommend reading this, is the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision where abortion was made legal in all 50 states. Now, at the time of the Supreme Court decision in 1973, there were abortion laws and regulations in all 50 states. Some states, like New York, were highly liberalized and would allow for abortion for almost any reason at all. And then there were other states that banned abortion, did not allow it to take place even within the states. And then there were most states that had varying laws about abortion. Well, the 1973 decision of the Supreme Court decision basically opened and legalized abortion in all 50 states. And the problem was, the reasoning behind the decision was that the justices said that somehow in the Constitution there was this right to privacy. Now, if you look at the Constitution, there is no obvious right to privacy. And so they're creating a right that is not found in the text of the Constitution. Now, under normal circumstances, in the original intent of the Founding Fathers for the justices, the judges would say, well, this is something that the legislation has to decide on, and we have no authority to create law. We have no authority to craft law. It's not our role to come up with legislation as justices, so we defer this back to the legislation and the lawmakers and the political process. And so that would have left it in the hands of the states. You would have had some states that would have stricter abortion laws. You would have some states with more liberal abortion laws, like the way it was. Instead, the justices took upon themselves the power to actually craft policy on abortion. This is never the intent of the Founding Fathers. Now, why did they do that? Because they do not believe that there is a higher law above them than their own rulings. They have taken and adopted, a majority of them have adopted this materialistic, evolutionary, atheistic worldview. Now, if you were to ask some of these justices, are you an atheist, they would probably deny it. But if you're doing things that show that you don't believe that there is a higher law above you, then you are essentially a practical atheist. And that's what these majority of justices did in 1973. They took it upon themselves to decide who would live and who would die. And there's nothing in the Constitution that gives them that right. There's nothing in the Constitution that would give them the powers to do this. Now, if there were legislative laws that defined the extent of when a woman could have an abortion through the democratic process, there would be plenty of Christians who would object to those, but at least it was a democratic process. So if you didn't like the laws in, say, New York State, you could get out of there and say, this is a Sodom and Gomorrah, we're leaving, this is going to be destroyed because of its sin, and you could move to a state that didn't have baby killing as something that was made common and abundant in that state. But the judges, because of their materialistic and secular worldview, they began to see themselves as these little tyrant gods who decide everything for everyone. And so this is how Marxism works. This is how Karl Marx envisioned. He envisioned the communist state as this all-encompassing, almost godlike power that would impose its will on society. It would decide for people what the society needed. And then his belief long-term was that this vanguard class, this power elite, would be virtual dictators. They would set and determine policy and enforce it through the gun and through violence. And they would shape and mold human nature to the point where at some future point, there wouldn't need to be a vanguard class because everyone would just naturally fall in line with the new communist vision for reality. Well, sadly enough, we're seeing that old understanding, that Karl Marx Communist Manifesto understanding of communism coming back here in the United States. And the reason it's coming is because it is a secular philosophy that has a vision for what it wants to do. And unfortunately, people have been indoctrinated in the secular teachings at the university level. They've been indoctrinated in Marxism, whether they knew it or not, through the media and through government and through all kinds of areas in pop culture. And it's really coming to a point here in our country, and especially also in the Western world, where there is going to have to be some kind of resolution that takes place. And that's a scary thought because we really don't know what that's going to mean long term. Is it going to be a revolution? I mean, we're reaching the point very close where you have half of the people who are drifting toward this secular vision, this materialistic vision of reality, in which there is no God, or if there is a God, he's so far away and so far removed that everything has to be determined by man. Even morality, values, truth itself has to be determined by man. That's that secular worldview. And then versus that is the traditional Judeo-Christian worldview, where it sees that God is above all, and that even judges and political leaders have to give an account to God, and that there are laws, moral laws, commandments written in the Bible and also in the human heart that God created there in the human heart because of the image of God, that everyone is created in the image of God. And so there are moral absolutes, there are moral principles. For example, in the traditional Judeo-Christian worldview that Francis Schaeffer talks about here, marriage is between a man and a woman. Not only is it revealed that way in the Bible, it's also written in the human heart. And we see sociologically, we look back in the history of civilizations, civilizations have always had the pairing off of men and women. And that has been one of the core bedrocks of any civilization, the marriage union. And that's what the traditional Judeo-Christian believers here in the United States and in the West have been arguing. Then this new view, this secular, atheistic, humanistic, godless, materialistic view says, no, we don't accept the traditional Judeo-Christian view found in the Bible and found also in the hearts of all civilizations. We rather are going to destroy that marriage understanding. And you see this in the feminist ideology that arose in the late 60s and especially in the 70s and 80s. This attempt to attack the marriage relationship. Gloria Steinem and other feminists, early feminists, were trying to argue that marriage is actually a patriarchal prison for women, and it was a slavery for women, and so forth, just undermining the whole institution of marriage. And so this secular worldview that we are seeing now, the cultural wars, if you ever wonder what that understanding of the cultural war is, this is it. And this is what Francis Schaeffer defined in a Christian Manifesto. Cultural war, secular vision for humanity, Judeo-Christian biblical view of humanity. And so right now we're seeing this secular humanistic worldview trying and seeking to destroy everything that the Judeo-Christian worldview has been built on. And we saw it 3 years ago with this gay marriage, Obergefell decision, 3 or 4 or 5 in 2015. We saw the assault on the traditional marriage where you had the Supreme Court of the United States, a majority of the Supreme Court justices, these unelected, lifetime appointed judges who are actually, at this point, almost godlike in their power. They took it upon themselves to actually redefine the institution of marriage. They actually took it upon themselves to change the entire definition of marriage in contrast with the Judeo-Christian understanding and the law written in each culture's heart that a man and a woman constitutes a marriage. They, in contrast to that, said, no, you can have 2 men or 2 women enter into a marriage, and that's perfectly fine because, after all, in the secular worldview, it's all social construct, their view is. And so something like marriage is simply invented by people, created by man, to achieve whatever purpose man wants to achieve. It has nothing to do with God, they say. It has nothing to do with eternal values. It has nothing to do with a revelation from the Creator. They leave the Creator totally out, in contrast to our founding documents, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, is how Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence. The materialists today want to do away with that in not only language, but the whole concept of a creator, nothing above us. Sort of like John Lennon's old awful song about Imagine, where he says, no heaven above us, no hell below us. So this secular humanistic worldview is asserting itself today as never before. That's what the culture war is all about. And as Christians, we come up to this election and we don't particularly like the background and the attitudes and opinions of the current president, but the opposite of him is unthinkable, and that is the secular, humanistic, materialistic, atheistic worldview is embodied in the Democratic Party in recent years. They want abortion, the killing of babies, not only all the way up until the point of birth, but they want infanticide. They want the doctor to be able to kill a baby born alive. And that's the Democratic Party. This secular, humanistic, materialistic, atheistic worldview is embodied in the Democratic Party. And they also want the confusion of gender. They don't want to accept the fact that there are men and women, male and female. They want to say, no, gender is a social construct. Again, this idea of humans invented these things. They aren't in the fabric of reality. They aren't revealed by a creator. They're just inventions. They're just conventions that humans created. And they go so far as to say that gender, a male or female understanding, is simply a social construct that humans invented, and they can be uninvented, and other categories can be introduced also. So again, you have this foreign worldview that is taking over the Western world today and actually threaten the very foundations upon which we stand. We see people who are questioning now the very foundations of our country, saying that it has to all burn down. They want to burn it all down so that they can create something new. What that something new is, they have not explained. But again, this is according to Karl Marx. He didn't actually understand what he would replace the old crumbled Western civilization with once the communist revolution came through. He figured that they would make it up as they go along. And that's exactly what the Russian Revolution said in 1917. They destroyed the old world, and then they said, well, we will make it up as we go along. We will make up laws as we go along. We will change laws from one thing to the other as the situation calls for. And eventually there will be the new communist utopian state, and this will be a better world because of it. Well, that never came to be. And it can't ever come to be because, as Francis Schaeffer talks about in this book, the secular materialistic worldview will always lead to a loss of freedom and destruction because it goes contrary to what God created in his creation. It runs contrary to reality. And the scary point is we have a lot of politicians now who are willing to overthrow the old Judeo-Christian understanding of culture and morality and humanity. And they have no idea what they're going to replace it with, but they don't seem to care. And that's why we see a lot of this demonstrations, the riots, the burning, looting. We see these radical politicians of a younger generation coming into play and gaining power and having these radical ideas, driving our nation deeper into debt, actually encouraging government spending and just spending out of control and higher taxation and free education, free health care, free housing, free food, everything, just all the socialist giveaway programs with no clue as to how this actually works. So we are actually in the fight of our life. It's a spiritual fight. It is not just a political, ideological fight. It is a spiritual fight. And we need to be praying that God brings about a spiritual revival. That's the only hope we have. So get the book, read the book, Francis Schaeffer's A Christian Manifesto. It'll help you understand what's going on in our society today. Well, I hope that's been a helpful commentary. We'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ in Culture. God bless.